All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the most important session of this time slot, in my humble opinion. So for the last year and a half or so, the GIS community and the PLS community have come together to discuss some things that needed to be discussed. And this originated from some issues that came before the NCBs, the Board of Examiners and Engineers, related to GIS practitioners and what they were pursuing in their own businesses primarily, but also on the government side. As a result of some of those discussions, the Geographic Information Coordinating Council took up the issue at one of its meetings and created a working group for PLS and GIS to dig deeper. And the approach that they took was to look at use cases to get a frame of reference first about some of the issues. So today, we're sort of culminating, at least initially, the work of our groups together with the NCB's community. And we have 4 excellent panelists who are going to participate. I'd like to also recognize folks that aren't here that were part of that common discussion. Andy Zotwheel from Charlotte, Stacy Smith from the Raleigh area, John Farley from NCDOT, and I'm missing someone. Alex, the chair of the council. I should probably mention that one. Alex Rankin. And Bob Brinson, who enjoyed this so much, he was with DPS that he retired. So, no, it's been very informative for all of us. We think we're going to yield a really good result, but this is the next step in sharing with you what we did. So today we have 4 panelists from the combined working group for GIS and PLS and the NCB's community. First, we have Kat Clifton from Davidson County, who has both a PLS and a GISP as part of her credentials. John Logsden from the McElwee Firm, LLC, from the Surveyors Committee of NCBs. Mike Benton, who has his own firm, PLS, Benton and Associates, Land Surveying and Mapping. And Kent Rothrock from Highland Mapping, who's CEO of that company. So this group, and the panelists are representatives of that group, met 6 times over the course of about 16, 18 months. And we really dug deep into determining the use of the terms that the PLS community uses and the GIS community uses that might mean different things to each of those professions. And then we dug really deep into the use cases. So the use cases originated from the working group for PLS and GIS, and there were 40 use cases that we considered that were boiled down to 22 use cases. The 22 use cases were individually discussed by the folks represented here and the folks that I named earlier. The overall goal after today and after some additional communication is to go back to the council and report what the working group found, make recommendations for increased communication, or if there are issues that need to be addressed beyond just the discussion phase, if there needs to be some modifications in language and statutes or whatnot, we would consider that as well or propose that, but I don't know that that's actually going to be the case given what's transpired over the last 18 months. And last but not least, communicate broadly, and I mean truly broadly. And we thought the GIS conference was an initial way to at least share the preliminary results of the work. Pretty much said most of what is here, but the purpose of the use cases is to prepare us to have a conversation. If you go into a conversation without some framework, it's difficult to make progress sometimes. And we thought that the right way to do this was to create use cases. And these use cases are going to be explained to a certain extent by the panelists, the ones that they feel strongly about describing to you. And they'll talk about some of the discussion that was held and then the final result as determined by the group that discussed it. The use cases range very widely, and I'm just going to leave this up on the screen here for a second so you can consume the wide variety of the types of things that the group discussed. The first one is really one that's unusual in that in the context of the group's discussion, we considered the fact that it may be more than just NCBs and the GICC groups that need to be involved in a discussion. There are other licensing boards in the state, such as Board for Geologists, for Architects, and so forth. So some of what we could discuss may also need to be discussed with those other professions. We haven't not taken that step yet, but that's one of the steps we could take. Some of the use cases tended to be clearly either a PLS responsibility and requirement or a GIS responsibility or requirement. And those were handled fairly quickly, but we tended to spend lots of time, maybe a couple of hours sometimes, on some of the use cases where it was not clear as to which direction it should go. And I'm going to count on the panelists to talk about that as well. This is the second 11 use cases. Clearly, some things that we all care about on that list, and some that required the most discussion. Use case 19 comes to mind where that's concerned. All of them were very important. All of them got equal attention. So we tried to clearly go through these in a methodical way, in a healthy, thoughtful way. So with that context, I think I'm going to turn it over first to Kat to talk about her perspective on some of the use cases, and then we'll just go down the panels. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to describe the things that they want to talk about. And I'd rather save time for questions and discussion after all of them have spoken. We've got plenty of time. The slot was scheduled from 10 to 11:30. Doesn't mean we have to take 10 to 11:30, but if we need to, with questions and so forth, that's fine.
Thank you, Tim. So just as a point of reference, I've been in GIS for 20 years, and I obtained my GISP in 2004 and PLS through the grandfathering system in 2014. I was pleased to be asked to participate in this work group. I think it's very important to understand whether you're a GIS person or have a PLS, what different activities are involved, where in the playing field you can create data or create a representation of data, where you can map, etc., and stay on your side of the fence, if you will. It was important when we first began meeting the idea about discussing different terms and definitions, because something as simple as what I said in terms of creating a data set, on the other side of the room when we were meeting at NCBs, there was some concern about, man, you're creating data. No, I'm creating a shapefile or a new data layer in a file geodatabase, and it's representative of, in my case, I'll talk today about street center lines and tax maps. But that was a key issue from the get-go in terms of creating data, even. And then you take that a step further. You have some data, and like a good GIS person, you want to perform some sort of analysis. Well, what we determined in talking about that analysis is if the data that you're utilizing comes from a authoritative source, then different activities such as buffer and proximity and tracing a network and all of those types of things, they relate back to that authoritative data set, and therefore even though it's new information, a new data layer that's created, you can trace the original accuracy back to that authoritative data set. One thing that we also talked about at NCB's was the local government exemption and how we anticipated that applying. So we still have state and local government exemption, and then there was this discussion about, well, what about councils of government and where do they fall? Because they perform work for smaller cities and towns, or they might perform work for a region, even a county. But we determined that, yes, in that role, in that task, they were performing that work as if they were local government, and therefore they fall under that exemption. So jumping into some of the examples, tax mapping. So despite what the public might think when they're looking at the online GIS, the line work that's there is an inventory of all the different documents, authoritative sources that were used to create that. There's a little disclaimer that people often don't read that indicates such, that the county or city, whoever's website it happens to be on, is not responsible, that this is just a representation, and if you really want to know where your property lines are, you need to go back to the original source documents. Or you need to get it surveyed. So those original source documents might include deeds or plats, other things that are considered authoritative at the Register of Deeds office. And that the features that are on the map that are called tax parcels are an inventory, and that they're primarily used for taxation purposes. So if you have a disagreement with your neighbor, you need to have that line surveyed as opposed to arguing over what's shown on the GIS. Now, during our discussion, we agreed upon this. This was a softball one, I guess, if you will. We didn't take long to agree on this, that it's just a representation. This work during the grandfathering time period when PLS was open to individuals who were GIS professionals, this work was not something that qualified individuals for credit to be grandfathered in as a PLS. So tax mapping in itself does not require a PLS. We agreed upon that. And instead, if you want to be certain of the authenticity of the line work, et cetera, you go back to the authoritative documents. So that was a nice check mark, if you will. The other thing that I work on quite a bit is street centerline. And that one's a little more fuzzy. So all of the cities and counties and so forth have street centerline information, and they utilize a number of different data sets in order to create that. You might use aerial imagery to eyeball something, heads up digitize. You might use a distance from a property line in order to trace along that property line to get the presumed center line of the roadway. But again, in both of those instances, the result is a street center line that's representative of where the road is. We're not building the road from that street center line. There are other activities also that we would consider needing to have more accurate information in order for them to occur, and I'll get to those in just a moment. But for the most part, when cities and counties are developing a street center line, they're simply doing what I spoke about in terms of creating it from based on other sources that are considered authoritative. And they are, again, an inventory. We use that terminology as well, representation or inventory of a network of roadways. Now, in each case that I pointed out, this street center line is not intended to indicate a precise location, and it's also not suitable for design, build, engineering activities. And the metadata, regardless of what data set or use case we're talking about, the metadata and disclaimer that you write for your data sets that are developed are really important to keep up to date for individuals who are utilizing your data. Because I learned long ago from a lady sitting in the room here that people come and go, but information stays. Okay? So for the most part, street centerline creation or representation is something that's a GIS activity and does not require a PLS. But there were 3 different conditional areas where a PLS would be required. For engineering design, for defining boundaries. So for instance, if your zoning line, if you needed a definitive, here's where the zoning line is definition, defining the boundary if that zoning line goes to the center line of your road, and there's some contention over whether that line work is accurate, then a PLS would be needed. And establishing different legal rights, such as setbacks and rights of way, if they're calculated from the street center line. And at the end of the day, I mean, after all of our discussion, I believe all of us were very pleased with that outcome in terms of indicating street center line is a GIS product, except in those 3 conditions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good, Kat. Next, we're going to move on to John Logsdon, and John will have amount of time to cover what he needs. And I have another slide that you wanted me to put up, the disclaimer slide. I can put that up on your cue. Yeah.
I'm on the Board of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors. I'm one of the surveying members of the board. Mike Benton is another surveying member of the board. I really appreciated the effort of all of the people who participated in the discussions that we had. There were 5 or 6 of those discussions. They went for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. It was a lot of work. A lot of people put in a lot of time on it, and the attitude of everybody who participated really made it a worthwhile exercise. From the board, and when I say board, I'm talking about the Board of Engineers and Surveyors. From the board's perspective, and where we started out with, is that if a particular activity is surveying, if it is done for authoritative purposes, and if it is done to a stated accuracy. So authoritative purpose and stated accuracy. That's where we started out. Now that is consistent with the model rules that are published by the National Council of Examiners of Engineers and Surveyors. Their model rules try to, there's a rule called inclusions and exclusions to the practice of surveying. The terms authoritative location appears repeatedly in the model rules, and one of the model rules as an inclusion in the practice of surveying is certification of positional accuracy of maps or measured survey data. So under not just our board rules, but the model rules, national model rules, if you are certified to a positional accuracy, you're surveying. So that was the beginning point. But then the question comes up, well, what kind of accuracy you're talking about? You know, within a mile? Surely that's not surveying. No, that's not surveying. So as soon as you show an example of, well, how about a mile? Then it becomes, well, it's not really a stated accuracy. We got to do some line drawing. And that's where a lot of the discussions come in, where is that line? What is the accuracy that we're talking about? And then is it for authoritative purposes? What does that mean? So we pretty quickly came to the conclusion that authoritative purposes, if nothing else, includes the determination of property rights. If there is a determination of property rights, that's an authoritative purpose. Now, it extends beyond that. For instance, design work. If somebody's going to be designing a water line, that's an authoritative purpose. And those measurements, whatever your stated accuracy is, it falls within the definition of survey. There was a lot of discussion about can a GIS professional, through an appropriate disclaimer, what is the role of a disclaimer? The board's position is, if it's surveying, you can't disclaim it. Okay? I mean, if it falls within the definition of surveying, you can't you can't practice surveying and say this isn't surveying. That won't work. So the two elements that we came to on the disclaimer part is the same two elements, which is an authoritative purpose and a stated accuracy. So if you're disclaiming those two things, and it's clear that that's what you're doing, then the disclaimer may have a purpose. And what we tried to do with this disclaimer, and this is the language that we came up with, the purpose of the disclaimer is to protect the public, not to protect the city who's doing the tax mapping or the GIS professional. Is to protect the public. So you want to put something on notice that is protecting the public. When the public looks at it, they will know what it is. There are a lot of disclaimers. I think every city and county that does tax mapping has a disclaimer on it. We looked at a bunch of those and tried to narrow that down. The next thing is that if you have a disclaimer that's designed to protect the public, try to design something that there's a possibility that the public might read it, as opposed to the license agreement I accept, and it's 35 pages of 8-point type, So we wanted to make it concise, so that the public would read it, and if they read it, would understand it. Try to make it in understandable language. We also wanted to make sure that the public understood the purpose of the map or report. So the GIS product is done for a specific purpose. I think others will talk about if the purpose is inventory, okay, that's probably not surveying. How many fire hydrants do we have? That sort of thing. That's not surveying, that's inventory. So the disclaimer needs to state what was the purpose of the report or the map. And it should also include an admonition that its use be limited to that purpose. What Catherine was talking about, the tax maps are so good and so, overlay the photograph on it. It's easy to use a tax map for a purpose for which it was never intended. And the public does that constantly. The disclaimer also should state that it is based on information that was compiled from primary sources, which should be consulted to verify the data that's in the map or report. So, and then finally, there needs to be a statement that it's not a survey. Now, this is the one where we have a little problem because from the board standpoint, if it's a survey, you can't say it's not a survey and get away with it. I mean, it's still a survey. And on that issue, we went to look at both the definition of surveying that's in the statute, and it's General Statute 89C, and in the rules that appear in the North Carolina Administrative Code, the board rules, and for those of you who want to look at those, it's 21 NCAC 56.1608. There is a quiz later on, so that will be on it. But that rule specifically sets forth what are the minimum standards for GIS surveys. And there's 5 classes of them. Class AA is the accuracy shall be equal to or no less than 0.033 meters, 1/10 of a foot. The Class A, half a meter, 1.64 feet. Class B, 1 meter, 3.28 feet. Class D, 2 meters, 6.56 feet. Class D, 5 meters, 16.4 feet, and then it ends. So if you have it just doesn't go beyond that. That's a Class D. So if you are doing work in which you are not certifying that it is better than, that the positional accuracy is closer than 5 meters, under the definitions of the surveying in the rules, that's not a survey. So we kind of get around that positional accuracy by a statement in the disclaimer that it doesn't comply. Oh, look, there's the number. It's actually at the end of the disclaimer. So you'll get 100 on the exam. It's the 5 meter standard. So you cannot certify, unless you are a PLS, that the work is better than 5 meter positional accuracy. So under the circumstances where you have disclosed the purpose of it, you have in your disclaimer admonition that it should not be used for any other purpose, the information is from other primary sources that should be consulted, the authoritative sources, the deed, for instance, if it was tax mapping. Look at the deed. Don't rely on this tax map. And then this is not a report. So this is the language that we came up with. This mapper report was prepared for the purpose of, and state of purpose, inventory of real property, initial project planning, that sort of thing, and should not be used for any other purpose. The information contained herein was compiled from previously georeferenced data and or public records, and these primary sources must be consulted for verification of the information contained in this mapper report. This map or report is not intended to indicate the authoritative location of the property boundaries, shape or contour of the earth, or fixed works, and this map or report is not a survey and does not meet the minimum accuracy standards of land information systems / geographic information systems in North Carolina 21 NCAC 56-1608. So that's the disclaimer that we came up with, and that was the rationale. And although, like I said, our board is not fond of disclaimers, I think that this is a way to put the public on notice as to what you're doing versus what surveyors are doing. Did I go over?
No, you're good. Next, we have Mike Benton to speak on his thoughts about the work of the use cases and describe some of that material.
Just let me say that it's an honor to be here to speak to you guys. Let me start off by saying that I'm actually wearing a couple of hats here. Number one, I'm wearing my board hat, and then secondly, I'm wearing my private surveyor hat. The board's sole purpose for its existence is to protect the public. That's the only reason that the board's there. And I can't tell you how many times out in the private world surveying that I have been approached by a client that says, that's not where the property line is, the property line's over there. And I ask them, well, why do you say that? And they whip out this pretty GIS map. And they say, because it shows right here, it's going right over there. And I have to go through and explain to them exactly what a GIS map and how it's produced and the accuracy of the GIS map. So the board is concerned about protecting the public, that they aren't misled by GIS maps. What you guys do is very critical. It's very important. I use GIS stuff every day in my work. But there, in some cases, is a very fine line between surveying and GIS. And hopefully that's what we're here to talk about today. When we first started these conversations between the GICC and the board, I quickly realized that some of our nomenclature that we use means one thing to the GIS professional, and it means an entirely different thing to the surveying professional. When we heard the GIS guys saying that they were analyzing data, well, I mean, that just sent up red flags and fireworks. Wait a minute, you can't do that. That's surveying. Surveyors analyze data. And we came to realize quickly that what they were talking about was something entirely different than what the surveyors were talking about. And this may be the first time many of you have actually even seen this, is read what the actual definition of surveying is. And as I read this, think about what you do every day in your practice, and you can kind of see that there's a lot of gray area in this. Practice of land surveying, providing professional services such as consultation, investigation, testimony, evaluation, planning, mapping, assembling, and interpreting reliable scientific measurements and information relative to the location, size, shape, or physical features of the earth, improvements on the earth, the space above the earth, or the part of the earth, whether the gathering of information for the providing of these services is accomplished by conventional ground measurements, by aerial photography, by global positioning via satellites, or by a combination of any of these methods, and the utilization and development of these facts and interpretations into an orderly survey map, plan, report, description, or project. And then it goes on further to say that the practice of the land surveying includes the following, and I won't bore you with the first, there were 7 of them. I'm just going to read you 2 of them. Number 5 is determining the configuration or contour of the Earth's surface or the position of fixed objects on the Earth's surface by measuring lines and angles and applying the principles of mathematics or photogrammetry. The other definition is also creating, preparing, or modifying electronic or computerized data, including land information systems and geographic information systems relative to the performance of the practice of land surveying. Now that's the definition of land surveying as it comes out of the general statutes of North Carolina. So during these discussions, we quickly realized how closely related our fields are, and we know that. Many of you, I guess everybody is aware that GIS is now governed by, it's under the umbrella of land surveying. Is everybody aware of that? Everybody? Yeah, and what Kat alluded to was the grandfathering process that took place, what, about 5 years, 6 years? 2014. Okay. So the reason that was done was because we did realize how closely related the two fields are. And getting into the use cases, one real good example, I actually had a case. One of the responsibilities of being on the board is whenever there is a complaint filed against a licensee, it's our responsibility to review the case, determine if there were any infractions, and if so, reprimand or whatever is necessary for that licensee. And there was a particular case where there was a question about a non-compete clause that an ex-employee had signed. And it happened to be a hairdresser or a hairstylist. And they had signed a non-compete clause that they couldn't practice within 5 miles of the existing shop that they had left. Well, in this particular case, the one filing the complaint went to a surveyor and said, I need to know if this new shop is within 5 miles of my shop. And they used GIS just to quickly pull it up, pull a distance, and came out to be 4.8 miles. Well, so they went to court. Excuse me. I'm sorry. It was over 5 miles. It was like 5.2 miles on the GIS. And so the one filing the complaint actually went to another surveyor and said, I want you to actually measure the distance from doorstep to doorstep and tell me. That's the one that came back 4.8 miles. And so, here is a clear-cut case of where GIS and surveying serves two different purposes. One of them showed, yeah, you're outside of the 5 mile range. The other one accurately showed, no, you're inside. It actually went to court. And just for the rest of the story, that particular surveyor that used GIS to measure that was actually charged with not doing what he was hired to do. He was hired to actually give an accurate distance, and he chose to use a not so accurate tool to give the answer. So that's just one example. There were other cases that we looked at, such as a sex offender web map. We all know what those look like. You can type in, you can bring it up, and you can see the little dots where registered sex offenders live. That's all well and good. When it comes to actually measuring the distance from where the sex offender's address is located to a school or a church that has kindergarten or nursery school facilities, they can't be within so many feet. Those kinds of things, and again, we talked about the two terminologies, stated accuracy or authoritative purposes. That's where surveying comes in. So, in one case, yeah, it's fine. You see the little marks. Yeah, here's where one lives. Here's where another one lives. Here's where another one lives. But when it comes to, hey, you're violating you are supposed to be, you can't be more than 2,000 feet from a particular nursery school or kindergarten. That's where the accuracy of the surveying has to come in. There was another example where we were talking about tracking maybe red-headed woodpeckers. Again, it would be almost like the sex offender map. Here's an area, here's an area, here's an area. But I had a situation where there was an actual hog operation that wanted to put in a huge farming operation, but the rule said it couldn't be within so many feet of an existing dwelling. And so couldn't just use GIS to say, yeah, you're outside. We actually had to survey that in to make sure that where the limits of the hog operation was going to be was outside of the bounds that they had to be for this dwelling. So there are cases where GIS is perfect. There are cases where surveying has to take place. And hopefully, by the end of this discussion, there'll be a little clear understanding of when you, as the GIS professional, need to tell your client, you know what, I can't do that. You probably need to go talk to a surveyor, because we don't want anybody to get in trouble for practicing surveying without a license. And that, again, is what the board is here for. So I yield the floor.
All right. Thank you, Mike. All right, batting cleanup. Kent Rothblock from Highland Mapping. And I would just like to say at this point, all of these folks have done a great job in discussing and sharing with you. And they did the same job during the individual meetings we had. So I wanted to thank them before we go any further. So.
Sure. And again, these guys have done a great job of sort of setting the table for what I'll say. A little bit of summary first. They're obviously, I can only speak from the GIS side, but there's always been a lot of misinformation, a lot of assumptions about what the board does. Obviously, what they're doing is rooted in the law, and we were fortunate during these meetings to have John, who's also an attorney, as well as David Tuttle, who's the board's counsel, in the room for every meeting. And that was very valuable because obviously language means everything when you're talking about the law. Believe it or not, it was non-contentious. There was nothing thrown. There was no screaming, no standing or pointing. Actually, they were very positive meetings. And again, I was honored to be asked to be there. And I learned a ton from these guys and from all the content. And when you get down in the weeds, it's really interesting. So let me just go through my notes here. One thing is it was funny because we started talking, and I always felt like the elephant in the room because I'm in there with a bunch of government people who are by and large exempt from the law, and a bunch of surveyors and engineers who obviously are all licensed. And here I am, the sole practitioner that doesn't have a license. But so it was funny. I felt like a lot of times we were talking about my situation in particular because I'm the unlicensed guy who's got to walk the line. But again, coming from where I came from, I wish I knew what I know now when I started my business 21 years ago. But hey, it's great now. So where's the line? It's very difficult. And they basically, and again, I'm not going to speak for the board, but they decide things on a case-by-case basis. You want to come from the GIS side and say, well, hey, here's the line in the sand, but it's just not that simple. And when we started going through the use cases, we had a bunch of great examples, and we spent hours on some of them. In fact, I'm going to bring one up in a minute that we probably spent the most time on. We're talking about you don't want to get in trouble. And again, a lot of people who may be thinking about doing their own business or something like that in the GIS realm, and there's a lot of people out there. I mean, I see new firms downstairs I've never seen before, and I know people that have gone out on their own and are trying to do this stuff, and you need to be aware of what you can do and what you can't do. And again, I think these guys have done a great job of sort of stating some of the basic facts. You can ask the board, you can contact them and give them a scenario beforehand, which is a great thing to know. So if you're a private practitioner, you're wondering, hey, again, I'm in the seat that I've had people come to me and say, hey, we want you to do this or that. And again, I think it was valuable in the meetings because I was able to give these guys a lot of examples of what people have asked me to do for them that may or may not be surveying, and then that drove a lot of our conversation. So know that you can always contact the board if you're not sure. So with that, I'll talk about a couple of examples. Number one, one thing that I think communication between the groups, and I know Tim's going to summarize on what we're going to do downstream, in the future, is really important, especially because of technology, right? So technology is driving a lot of this overlap. GIS is this massive blanket now that's everywhere. So, the whole drone thing, I mean, I'm sure there's kids getting out of school that their parents got them a drone for Christmas, and they've got a geography degree, taking a couple classes, and now they're gonna go use their drone and start a business. Well, again, you got to be careful in that realm. You got to know, obviously there's things with the FCC you've got to do, but also what are you doing? Are you flying videos for golf courses, for marketing documents, or are you flying photography that's going to be used for engineering and surveying or some sort of designs? Again, the technology is exploding. So I wanted to talk briefly about this one. One use case that came up was UC10, indoor positioning and visualization for buildings. And I won't read it all verbatim. But the idea is, let's say you've got some nifty software on your phone and somebody hires you, or you're bidding on a job to go and map indoor assets. So you could take just the idea, and I don't even know if this technology's there, it's probably close, where you could basically take a phone and scan a room, and you're basically taking pictures of all the outlets and all the light fixtures and all the doors and all that sort of thing. Is that surveying or engineering? Those are sort of tough questions, but I think it's a good example of how technology, a technological shift or some new thing, new gizmo that we can use, opens some doors that you've got to consider. Again, we sort of didn't really come up with a great summary on that one. We said there was interest in taking this use case to the Board of Architecture and the Board of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors. However, given the discussion, it could require a license or not. So that was one of those that we're not really sure yet. Again, if they're taking scanning information for foundational elements or to do construction, it's probably surveying and engineering. If you're doing things just so we know where all the light fixtures are and how many light bulbs we've got to replace every 6 months, probably not. But again, there's sort of a lot of gray area there. So I thought that was a good example. And then the big one, and this one took, and again, I'm going to mention this one only because I think it hits on a lot of the points of the whole conversation that we had. It was UC19. And I don't remember who brought this up. I know I was able to talk about it in great detail because I'd have people years ago. I don't really have people ask me to do things like this nowadays. But a lot of times people are looking to develop land. So I live up in the mountains, a lot of people buying and building subdivisions and whatnot. And the idea was the sort of basis, without again getting into all the weeds here, was somebody comes to a firm like mine, a little surveying firm or a little GIS firm, and I've got 200 acres I just bought and I'm going to develop it at some point. I'm not ready to lay lots out and do all that sort of thing, but I want you to make me a map and I want to see all the parcel lines and the streets and the hydro and contours. Okay? So that led into a great discussion because we talked about, in the GIS world, I can take LiDAR data, which again is everywhere nowadays, and digital elevation models, which have been around for a long time, and with just a couple of clicks, I can turn them into 2-foot contours, right? And so, again, that's another example of technology sort of getting you in trouble as a private unlicensed practitioner. And what we talked about was how, well, the LiDAR data and or DEMs coming from the state are sealed. So that means we've had a licensed photogrammetrist or surveyor engineer put their stamp on it and say, this data is good, right? But the problem is when you try to extrapolate that down, and that may be the wrong term, but you're trying to cut that down to a small parcel, really takes surveying know-how to be able to accurately create contours and understand where break lines are. So even though the basis of the data is a sealed product that's been blessed by somebody with a license, converting it to 2-foot contours is probably surveying. And again, that's what we came up, that was our recommendation, that's what we all agreed on, is that it is. Now, the other side of that is if I use 2-foot contours from the DOT's website, those are understood to be sealed and created by a licensed surveyor, engineer, photogrammetrist, and I can utilize those as long as I use a disclaimer and go into some detail, again, what John went into earlier. So again, I think that's a great example of how you've got to consider a lot of the facts, and it's really a case-by-case basis. There's so many things nowadays that can come up and that this technology can do, and we've got to understand, where the lines are. And again, coming from where I came from, purely GIS background, it was great for me to understand where these guys are coming from and understand their role and what we're doing here. And again, it was a very positive experience, and I'm hoping we had great communication. I think we all sort of saw eye to eye on most things, and I'm going to be excited and interested to see how this goes downstream. From a GIS perspective, again, I felt like we had great rapport and an understanding with the guys we met with. But what I worry about is what happens if that board turns over and we get a new group of people that come in and don't really have the benefit of all those detailed conversations. So again, I'm interested in how we're going to sort of keep the information we gleaned out of these meetings. The law is not going to change at this point. So how are we going to utilize all this and move forward? And again, I think a big part, and Tim's going to talk about this, is communicating in the future is let's talk to these guys regularly. Let's keep the communication open. Let's not just get in our silos and talk about what they're doing and just make assumptions. So,
Very good. Okay, we're going to get to questions, but before we go to the questions, I want to give each of the other panelists an opportunity to comment things you thought about while other people were talking and that kind of thing, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, I would like to follow up or piggyback on what Kent was talking about on UC 19. Again, GIS is a great tool, a great planning tool. A client comes in to Kent and says, the scenario, I've got 200 acres here, and I just want some sort of preliminary planning map. Maybe show me the contours so that I can kind of see where the more level flat areas are, where maybe I could possibly put a clubhouse or maybe dig a pond or something like that. Just something very, very preliminary. That's a great tool. But one of the things that you do have to be careful of is bringing that raw LiDAR data in, punching the button, and magically coming up with contours. Do you really understand what's happening there? I could actually see where some trouble could be, you could run into some trouble because not putting the brake lines exactly where they need to be, like there's a valley in here and I've got a peak of a ridge here and a peak of a ridge here, and not really defining where that valley is could make the contours come out incorrect, which could lead to the developer saying, this is where I want to put this based on erroneous contour lines, and it could potentially come back to bite you doing something like that. That's why we're saying use something that's already been developed. That way you're not taking the liability of creating those contours, nor are you practicing surveying without a license. So, John, did you have anything to say about that?
Of course.
The attorney.
So the example that pops into my mind is that with this raw LiDAR, because we spent a lot of time on this one, is the software that transforms raw LiDAR data into contours, is that the equivalent of statistical analysis. Now you have either a bar graph or a pie chart. It just is different ways of representing the raw data. So is that all you're doing? And from a surveying standpoint, we don't believe that's all that is going on there. That there is the transformation of the raw data into a digital elevation model or into contour lines involves substantially more than that. And I'll just take the example of the model rules from the National Council of Examiners of Engineers and Surveyors. They're included within the practice of surveying is adjustment or authoritative interpretation of raw survey data. So that's really what's going on, is you're taking, the LiDAR is the raw surveying data. It's certified as being accurate, but it's just raw data. The creation of contour lines or digital elevation models is the adjustment of or interpretation of that data, and that is a surveying function.
Anyone else?
I'll follow up with just one more briefly on that as well. Again, we went hours on 19. The reason somebody would come to somebody like me in the first place is because it's cheaper. Is because we can take a 200-acre tract and throw contours and parcel lines and all that and do it in an hour. If you go to a surveyor and say, hey, I want to lay out contours and all this on a 200-acre tract, it's going to be a lot more expensive. So the whole concept was, well, what if they come and they just want to get an idea, and then of course they're going to go to a surveyor to lay out the roads and the lots and do all the real high-end stuff. And that's sort of the genesis of that. One more point I'll make before we turn it over to questions is one thing that another little fuzzy area is downstream use of data. So again, we talked ad nauseum about how it's inventory. If you're doing inventory of something, it's not, and you're not guaranteeing a stated accuracy, it is going to be okay, right? But what happens, depending on what you do as a private non-licensed practitioner, if somebody misuses that data downstream? So if a good example, some town hires somebody like me or another non-licensed GIS firm or individual to locate fire hydrants just for inventory. We just want to know where the fire hydrants are, right? We're not building a network or anything like that. And that's fine. We do it. We use orthophotography or, whatever technology you want to use. Create them. We put our disclaimer, in the delivery report or whatever. But then what if down the stream it's being used to try to do some sort of design by an engineer? Am I liable now? And again, as a private non-licensed practitioner, you need to be thinking about that, because if I say the hydrants are here and then the fire department tries to use that in a fire and the fire hose isn't long enough and somebody's house burns down, can they then come back and sue me for that? Perhaps. So again, those are more complications, is the downstream use of data. It's not always cut and dry. That's why it was very difficult to say, well, here's line. It's moving and it's sort of a big gray area. But again, I'll leave it there.
Okay. So now we're going to go into the question and answer phase, or the comment phase, however you want to say it. You need to use the mic, so we're recording. We're not recording to incriminate anybody. We're just recording.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a quick comment, just so everybody understands. The government exemption does not extend to contractors. So if I have folks in my work for the state of North Carolina, if I have folks in my shop creating data, it's under the government exemption, and we put the disclaimer on it. If you use it and you're a contractor, that doesn't apply or extend. If we use folks, say a local jurisdiction we use folks in the utilities department to collect their data, they may be able to do things that private contractors can't because they're exempt, even if that government hires you. So it's just something, it's a, I think, important distinction.
Okay.
So I have a couple of comments and then a question or two. So I come from both sides of the fence. I started out land surveying. My dad was a surveyor engineer. So as soon as I was able to carry a bush axe and machete. I was out in the field cutting line, pulling chain. I've actually used a Gunther's chain, and then migrated into GIS. And so I always have thought they were great complementary professions that really ought to be working more together than trying to fight each other over territory. So one of the things I'm very excited to hear y'all talk about, and this has always been the dividing line for me, is that guaranteeing accuracy, stating this is accurate to this level, whether it's 1 in 10,000 feet or whatever. That's always been because GIS people are not trained on how to really calculate the accuracy of the data that they're creating. And to me, I don't care if they want it guaranteed within 1 mile or within 1 centimeter. That was the realm of the surveyor. That was what we were trained to do. I say we, I'm not licensed, but and so anytime that came out, that should be surveyor. Other than that, if you want to go out and collect, like you said, inventory things, that's great. So I'm very happy to hear that. The other thing I want to add into this is that I really think we need to be talking more, and I'm glad to see it's happening here in North Carolina. I think this is the exception rather than the rule. I just came, I'm from Georgia, and we this past summer had a issue where the Surveying Mapping Society of Georgia, which is heads up and does those, was working with the board to do new language to define surveying that really broadened that scope without any discussion with the GIS community. And it was a last minute, we found out about it and almost came to blows. It shouldn't have happened if we'd been included. But what I want to know is 2 things. One, you mentioned contractors aren't covered, but what if you're an individual contractor? I'm a 1099 employee working for government. So you're not covered in that case. And 2, if the whole purpose of the statute is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, why is government exempt? They're creating as much data as the private sector is, and in many cases, they're using it for engineering design purposes. There's a city engineer, a county engineer. They send some people out in the crew to collect road data and all that, and they're designing off that. So what's the validation for that exemption? I've never really understood that.
Nor have we.
You want to fill that one?
I don't have a good explanation for the reason for government exemption. There's a couple of exemptions. There is an industrial exemption. So, for instance, if there is a work going on entirely within a facility owned by a private entity, they can do the surveying work within that facility. And okay, that was a little easier to understand. But your point is well taken. And all I can say is that the legislature wrote the rules, and it's the way it is.
Yeah, and just one follow-up on that also, what John was talking about the contractors. Yeah, I want that to be perfectly understood that you as a third party, if a government entity or municipality comes to you and wants to hire you to do particular work, you are not exempt under their umbrella because you're doing work for them. You have to be licensed in order to do particular work. We discussed a use case where we were talking about going out and locating manholes. I think we spent quite a bit of time talking about this particular one. You, as a private contractor, if the municipality hires you to do that for them, and it's going to be used strictly for in-house use for that municipality, John, am I correct in saying, yes, you can do that? You can do that for them. But it's, I believe John said it best, the toothpaste is already out of the tube at that point, because now the municipality can put that information out there and anybody can get a hold of it. So, it's a real fine line there, whether you should do it or whether you shouldn't do it. And the golden rule is if it's for inventory purposes only, it's more than likely GIS work. If it's going to be to a stated accuracy or authoritative use, it's going to be surveying work.
You guys.
I'll make one comment about the government exemption. I don't know why it exists either, but I've operated under that for 20 years now. So, but in doing so, I recognize that in any job where I've been, that I do work for the public that can have a significant impact upon them. And particularly in Salisbury, when I was there, we had crews going out collecting information. We did it in-house primarily because of the cost associated with it. But we coordinated with local surveyors to have known points at each of our offices so that when we were going out to collect information, we always collected that first known point outside the office before we collected anything else, so that we would have an understanding of what kind of accuracy we had. We coordinated with Gary Thompson and received training directly from them. Our field crews did that so that we would have as good an understanding as possible about the equipment that we were utilizing and the accuracy of the equipment and how to recognize when we were getting garbage back. You know, how to recognize good versus bad, as opposed to just blindly pulling in information.
Well, the only thing I'll say is I don't really have a comment on the government exemption, but I do believe, and guys, please correct me if I'm wrong, that as a GIS practitioner, I can be a subcontractor for a licensed engineer or surveyor, and not necessarily doing licensed engineering or surveying, but doing GIS things under their supervision.
That is correct.
Okay.
So I wanted to comment on the government exemption because we asked the same question. It didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And I think it was Alex, I don't know if he's in the room, that one of the people on both sides of the fence that said it was his understanding the logic behind it was profit driven. For a government, we're not trying to make money, we're not trying to make a dollar. I mean, well, we're trying to make money, but we're not charging somebody to do something. And that profit-driven motive is why the government exemption exists, because it's almost like the industrial one. We don't create data for the fun of it. We do it to perform our work. We provide it out to the public because there's value to that. But we're not selling it to the public. And as soon as you accept money and state an accuracy, you know, you're surveying, and there's a motive there, theoretically.
So there's probably not a big surprise that I've got a question for the panel. For those of you who know me, just for context, I was part of the original discussions. I was on the working group before the board turned over. I had a business, and I got caught up in this discussion in the early days before a lot of the intellectual discussions about where these lines are drawn happened. I have a question for the panel because I wasn't involved in the second phase with the new board. I wrote about a third of the use cases that you guys debated. I organized a slew of volunteers who also participated in writing the remaining ones from academia, from planning firms, from engineering firms, from geology firms, from a lot of private business. There was a lot of professional contribution from the larger community that went into the use cases that were debated here. And so I have a few observations and a couple of questions. I'm now working in government, and it is a really scary thing to be working with engineers in government and bring up the topic of metadata and have an engineer tell you, oh, I never read metadata. Does anybody else here ever read metadata? And to have that comment made, because there is also a line of accountability for the professional practitioner who is board licensed to qualify the data that they collect and use, and to read the metadata, because something that's been a part of GIS for decades is the authoring of metadata to describe the data, why it was collected, why it was created, what its appropriate use is. And to just grab a download off a website and go to town because you got a contract and you're billing, now a state or local government client is a bad practice. So that responsibility does not need to be, in my opinion, so my observation, a responsibility of the GIS practitioner. There are boards that license those professionals, and those professionals should be held accountable for bad practice through their own professional associations and networks. And so we document what we create in order to provide that information, and to have that just in general conversation come up as frequently as it does in almost 2020 is a scary thing, because that means there is bad design work being done despite our best intentions, despite disclaimers. And I didn't go to engineering school. I don't know how to qualify it for their use. I can be told to go get that data by someone whose direction I'm working under, and if they're not reading the metadata and taking responsibility for the work that they do, that is a problem of education and practice that should be addressed through the other boards, the other professional associations, in my opinion, making sure that those professionals know that that's on them. They're the ones who are sealing it, and they're the ones who can be personally sued for doing bad work. And maybe they are doing something using GIS when they ought to be doing a different method. I can't make that decision for them. But I would like to know, did the board discuss the role of metadata in this context and any other use cases, or the panel? Sorry, didn't mean to call you a board, call you a panel. And I would like to know, is this the only public comment period based on the work to date, or are there plans in the summary that Tim gives, for the wider community to have a broader discourse on some of the use cases and get that comment? Because if we are all to start to adopt best practices and start to scrutinize the work we do and really interrogate the person who's asking us to do something to be sure that we don't have some liability out there that we didn't go to get a geography degree or a GIS degree in order to assume. What are the comments you have about that question?
All right, comments? We got about 15 minutes. Or longer if you want to spend part of your lunch doing this. It's fine with me. Okay.
I can tell you that any data that a surveyor or an engineer downloads and uses, they have got to do whatever is necessary for them to accept that work. That work becomes theirs. They can't download this data, design something go wrong, and then go back and point the finger at somebody else. Once you download that information and use it, you own it. Even though that it is signed and sealed by somebody else, you're using that information, it's on you. So there was some discussion about metadata. And I'll tell you, these guys know a whole lot more about metadata than these guys over here. We really don't care about metadata. I know that may shock you to hear that. And probably all the GIS guys are out there going, what? You don't care? We're looking at I guess what we're looking for is the final product. And when we see a signed and sealed final product, that says to us that you've done everything that is necessary to produce that data. So probably in the GIS world, metadata means a whole lot more to you guys than it actually means to us. And there again, it may go back to nomenclature a bit, because I know in GPS surveying, we have to add metadata information when we certify that stuff. And what we call metadata and what you guys call metadata is kind of two different things, I think. Well, I'm talking about the type of equipment used, the procedure used to collect the data, the accuracy standards that were met, that kind of stuff. And I probably shouldn't say this, but I wouldn't even know where to go look to find the metadata from something that I downloaded from a GIS. All I see is just the contour lines, or all I see is just the raw LiDAR data. I wouldn't even know where to go look for it. And it's probably because I don't have the GIS software that would tell me that. So don't beat up the engineers too badly when they say they don't look at the metadata. It's probably because they just...
I guess my point is you should be doing it.
Yep.
You should, A, know it exists, and you should be doing so, and that this needs to get communicated if you're going to qualify downstream usage and make sure that people are using the data they need to be using for the cycle. It tells you in the metadata when you might survey, and there's lots of fields there to record the equipment you use, whether it's cloudy or not, the accuracy. This is where that information lives, and that there's this large ignorance about the fact that it exists and that you can actually access that information. It's common, and it's really.
And there are national standards on creating that metadata that most of us try to follow.
And the GIS shop should obviously, hearing this, make it easy to get to and obvious where to find it. Obviously in GIS, we've been talking about it for a long time, and the practice of actually populating metadata is widely varied. I know lots of places that there's no metadata for anything, and it's great. You know, I know everybody's stretched and nobody's got time, but, you know, we're sort of in the infancy here. That's still the first 20, 30 years of GIS, but 100 years from now, people are going to be using this data. We're going to all be dead and gone, and people are still going to be using the parcel lines that we're creating today. And when you think about that, it's really staggering. The data is going to outlive every one of us. And so metadata is going to become important, more and more important. Obviously, we should do a great job. And coming, again, from a private, non-licensed practitioner, metadata is very, very important for me. And just one more comment. It's just, obviously, it's all about education and education across disciplines. You know, people getting out with GIS degrees, and I can speak for Appalachian State, ASU Mountaineers. You know, we weren't talking about surveying. You know, those guys are coming out of college, whether it's a bachelor's or a master's, and they don't know a lot about that. So I think, you know, efforts need to be made at multiple levels, including academia, to sort of get the word out. Again, conferences are a great place for us to talk about it. And, you know, there may be people in this room who've never even thought about this intersection of GIS and surveying, that it needs to be talked about and thought about.
Anybody else before I get to the next question?
And I'm not going to say anything about metadata, so thank you. It's kind of my thing. I want to thank John for reading the model law. I think we can agree that it's pretty broad, above the earth, below the earth, the compilation of plans, modification of data. So my question to you is, given the hard work that you've done with these use cases, and you have really, you've really created some clarifications that are great value. I mean, you've derived this through this work, and I applaud you for that work. My question or my charge to you is, will that information, that hard work, that clarification, will that go back into the law so that it can become more specific, or in surveying terms, more accurate?
I used to be a distance runner. Yeah, I think this okay.
I understand the on any that it would be helpful to have a series of rules with the standing of regulations or statutes. But going down that road will cause, I'm afraid, more problems in that the situations don't fit into, you would end up with a blue million statutes.
Well, let me clarify. I go back and look at that paragraph and make that opening paragraph a better, more accurate paragraph of the practice of surveying. I'm not talking about opinion.
Which opening paragraph?
Of the model law.
Activities that must be. Oh, no, that's not, I'm sorry, I confused two things. The model law is published by the National Council of Examiners, but what he read was from the North Carolina statute.
Right, so in North Carolina, can we write a better law? You've done a lot of work here. Let's build on it.
Yeah, okay. Now you're asking a question that probably the board of examiners, of engineers and surveyors, cannot lobby for a change in the statute. That has to come from others. Our job is to enforce or to apply the statutes and the rules as they were written. So we can't do that, but you can. You can go to your legislatures and say, this is not working for the GIS community, and we would like to propose a change in the statute. But the board cannot initiate that by law.
How about the surveying community?
The surveying community could, same way as the GIS community could. Yep.
John, what about updating the inclusions and exclusions document?
Yeah, so the exclusions and exclusions document is a guideline of the board, and that's the board, and I wasn't there at that time, but went through a similar process years ago to come up with that. And Tim, if you can speak to that, but I think that we are talking about modifying that inclusions and exclusions based upon the use cases. So yeah.
Absolutely, and that's going to be one of the next steps, I believe. So there were more questions out here, so I don't know who was first, so I'll just go to the closest person.
Thanks, Tim. So I appreciate the work that you guys have done. I'm just going to ask a question to the group here. How many people want to talk about this more offline outside of the discussions that are happening here? If I was to put an email out onto the NCGIS list, would you guys respond appropriately? Okay. So I think that's what we're going to try to do to help further the discussion amongst ourselves to maybe grow that a little bit. I'll send that out. My name's Eric Wilson. I'm with Geodecisions. We have some experience in this area amongst multiple states. And there's value to the discussion that we have available to us as a group to do exactly what they're saying, is to lobby and to put our voices ahead to the legislature to fight for our rights as well. And I'm not saying we need to be divided, but we do need to have a discussion, especially coming from the consulting side as well. So look for that.
Who's next?
So this is a quick question. My name's Chris Contreras. Been doing GIS for about 25 years, also a PLS, trained in both in the military, way back in the day in the Marines, GPS, GIS, surveying, satellite imagery, the whole gamut. My question is, I just want to know what kind of metric here, how many people here are PLS? Just to see what it looks like.
No, real.
She said no real PLS. Does that strike anybody? Can you clarify that? I just wanted to know what it looked like, what the faces look like of PLS versus GIS here in the room when we hear this kind of discussion. We see the representation that we had up there, and we know that Kent is really outnumbered, but maybe not so much here in the crowd.
All right.
I just wanted to make a brief comment to the question about the government exemption and pointing out that government exemption has existed for a long time before all these
intricacies had been worked out, and going back into a period where the GIS community and the surveying community were not in as much of a cooperative environment, that there was conflict between it. And if you look at that statute and you literally read it, a lot of the things that are in that statute sound like they're describing property mapping, even though property mapping is not intended to be surveying. And for years and years, anytime somebody would want to know where a line lied on the ground, it was just automatically to legally determine where a line lies on the ground, you must have a licensed surveyor come out and locate it. But what can't you tell? No, the only way to legally determine where a line lies on the ground is to have a licensed surveyor. That was just like a automatic thing. But there are property mappers who don't specify that, who haven't had the proper amount of education and understanding that what their role is versus the role of the surveyor. So maybe now, with all these things, the government exemption isn't as necessary, but at one time it was.
Comments?
Hi, I apologize if I missed this, but are these available out online somewhere where we can read? And the response to the comment period, I wasn't sure if I just missed that or how we comment and how we get that to you in a timely fashion.
I think I can address some. Anybody else have a burning question?
My question is, and I come from a background of, excuse me, I was a real estate broker commercial real estate broker for 17 years and also a commercial appraiser. And so I was always the downstream user. And I'm curious about how, when you talk about the other professional fields, and obviously there's not a lot of those in this room to really address right now, but how are y'all planning on reaching out to that potential downstream user? Yeah, I knew if I wanted a general idea, I could go in GIS, figure out where to put a shopping center. Wasn't, just sort of looking around. As an appraiser, I was going in and saying, hey, I want to find 10-acre tracts, raw land, filtering down. But going back to your definitions of what's surveying, what's not surveying, if I'm going out looking for all the Walgreens in a market within every 2-acre tract of land that's zoned so-and-so within a 2-mile radius, am I practicing surveying? It sounds like if I'm measuring that distance, I guess was my question previously, or for what you were previously saying. But and maybe I'm getting a little too deep in the weeds on the use of that GIS data later. Are y'all going to be talking to some of those groups that are using the data to sort of say, okay, this is what delineates surveying from GIS work going forward so that they're knowledgeable and they're protected, so that it's not just on the GIS office or the surveyor to be able to educate?
This will be the last one. I want to wrap up and move us forward. So.
Yeah, the example that you gave about looking up 2-acre tracts of land with Walmarts or Walgreens or whatever, that certainly would not be considered.
Well, within the radius, go back to like the...
And even that would not be considered surveying. If it came down to a legal issue of this Walgreen can't be so many feet from this Rite Aid, something like that, then yeah, that would cross over into surveying. But for just a general inventory type purpose like that, no, that's GIS work strictly.
But in the case of like an appraiser, lots of times they may be doing an appraisal say for court. That they're relying on that for legal purpose, that GIS data from a data set standpoint.
there again, I think it would depend on exactly what the use of that data was going to be. If it was going to be given to a stated accuracy or exact distances, something like that, then yeah, that's going to be surveying. If it's just a generalized map of something inventory type purposes, no.
Okay, I'm going to wrap us up.
Let's have a quick comment.
Okay. Sure.
I'm a surveyor, but I would like to say that surveyors should know what metadata is, because I think we've been putting metadata on our maps ever since we created maps. That would be the county, the township, the city, the datum that was used, the accuracy.
And I agree with you 100%. When I was talking about metadata, I was talking about the kind of metadata that is specific to GIS. Yeah, I agree with it. Again, it goes back to that nomenclature stuff again. What you guys use and what we use are kind of two different things.
Okay. Very good, Mike. Thanks. All right, to wrap us up, next steps. I know you're anxious to hear what those are, so I'm going to give you a few. So obviously today was the first bit of feedback on this material. This material has not been shared even with the working group, which it was a timing issue. The conference appeared before the time that we could get the working group back together. The next step here is to take all the material that this group and the group in the audience that's represented by these two organizations is going to be reviewed by the working group for PLS and GIS. Eric, I appreciate your willingness to get additional comment, but I mean, there's structure here too that would be great if you could fit into the structure. So we want the maximum number of people to comment on this now that the use cases have been fully vetted by this group. Ultimately, we get to the council with some recommendations about what happens next. Some of that could involve proposed legislation for changes that are representative of the GIS community as a result of all this. That's one possibility. There are probably other possibilities too, but ultimately it comes to the council. I'd like to set a goal of coming to the council at its May meeting. It's May the 8th, so that means between now and roughly the end of April, we get the working group together to review everything that's written, get additional comment. If we're not ready by May 8th, we can push it to August, but when we're ready as a community, we need to take this back to the council. The annual check-in is something that the group that met between NCBs and the GICC representatives decided we needed to do. It had been about 7 years since the group had lengthy discussions, and we thought it's a good opportunity for us to check in as groups every year. So we're planning to do that, and we'll discuss what we need to discuss at that time. If there are new things that have come up as a result of practitioners in the GIS community, practitioners in the surveying community, new issues that we need to talk about, we'll reconvene the group and discuss them. And that will conclude the work, at least this iteration of the interaction between the GIS and the PLS communities. So I'd like to thank all the panelists. I'd like to thank everybody that's in the audience for sticking around. Great job, everybody. We're adjourned.